The restaurant buzzed with noise and chatter, a mix of clinking glasses and laughter from neatly dressed guests. It was her first day there. She stood near the kitchen door, wearing the simple black uniform the manager had given her, and held a small notepad in her trembling hands. Everything around her felt loud and fast. Waiters moved quickly between tables carrying trays stacked with plates. The smell of roasted garlic and grilled fish floated in the air. But her eyes were drawn somewhere else, toward the shiny black piano that sat near the corner of the dining room. It looked out of place in the middle of all the chaos. Its surface gleamed under the warm lights, and the stool beside it seemed untouched. A faint longing stirred inside her as she looked at it. She hadn't touched a piano in years, not since the day she walked away from music, leaving behind a part of herself she thought she would never find again. "Hey, new girl." The sharp voice of the manager snapped her out of her thoughts. He was a man in his 40s, tall and neat, with a trimmed beard and eyes that always looked like they were judging something. He came toward her, holding a clipboard. "Don't just stand there daydreaming. You're here to work, not stare at furniture." She nodded quickly, lowering her gaze. "Yes, sir." "I'm sorry." He looked at her for a moment, then followed her gaze toward the piano. A grin spread across his face. "Ah, that thing? It's just for decoration most days. Our regular pianist plays on weekends. You won't need to worry about that." Then with a chuckle, he added, "And just to be clear, if you ever touch it, I'll quit myself. Got it?" The staff nearby laughed, and even a few guests turned to see what the fuss was about. She forced a polite smile, though inside her chest something tightened. She nodded again, quietly saying, "Of course." The manager walked off, shaking his head, still amused by his own joke. The others went back to their work, but she kept her eyes on the piano for one more second before turning away. The day went by in a blur. She tried to learn table numbers, remember menu items, and carry plates without shaking. Her feet ached, her arms hurt, and she kept apologizing for the smallest mistakes. But even through the exhaustion, every time she walked past the piano, her heart would skip. It was like seeing an old friend from another life. After the last guest left, she stayed behind to clean. Most of the staff had gone home, but she didn't mind. The restaurant was quiet now, with only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of rain outside. She wiped down the tables, stacked chairs, and swept the floor. As she passed the piano, she paused. The light from the ceiling reflected softly on its surface. Her fingers twitched. She reached out slowly, not to play, just to touch it. The smooth wood felt warm under her hand. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost hear the music again. Her music floating gently through the air, the kind that used to make her heart race when she was younger. "You're still here?" The voice startled her. She quickly pulled her hand back. The manager had returned from his office, holding a set of keys. His expression was unreadable. "You can go home now. We close up soon." "Sorry," she murmured. "I was just finishing the cleaning." He glanced at the piano and then at her. A small smirk tugged at his lips. "Just remember what I said about that piano." She gave a quick nod and left, her cheeks warm with embarrassment. Outside, the rain had stopped and the night air felt cool. She pulled her jacket tighter and started walking home, her shoes splashing in the puddles. Her mind wasn't on her tired feet or her aching back. It was on the sound of the piano she hadn't touched in years. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to when she was younger, back when music was her whole world. She used to spend hours at the piano, playing until her fingers went numb. She had once performed on big stages where the crowd stood in silence, moved by every note she played. Those days had ended suddenly after a loss too painful to bear. Since then, she couldn't bring herself to play again. She thought if she avoided it, maybe the pain would fade, but it never really did. The next few days at the restaurant were busy. She learned quickly, becoming more confident with each shift. The other workers warmed up to her. She helped everyone, smiled often, and never complained. But still, the piano called to her. Sometimes, when no one was looking, she'd wipe the dust off its edges while cleaning, pretending it was just part of her job. Other times, she would whisper to herself, wondering how it would sound now after so long. One evening, the restaurant was packed. The pianist who usually played on weekends hadn't shown up. The manager paced near the door, frustrated. "Where is he?" "We can't have dinner service without music," he muttered. Guests were already seated and the noise of chatter filled the air. But something was missing. The soft tunes that usually floated through the room weren't there. One of the older servers, polishing glasses, looked at the young woman and teased, "You keep staring at that piano, maybe you should give it a try." The manager heard and laughed loudly. "Her? Come on, she can barely carry plates without trembling. I doubt she knows a single note." The others chuckled, but she stayed quiet, pretending not to care. Still, her heart ached. They didn't know that music had once been her life, that every key on that piano held memories she was too afraid to touch. Later that night, after the rush had ended and most of the staff were cleaning up, she found herself alone again near the piano. The lights were dim, the restaurant peaceful. She sat on the stool just for a second, telling herself she wouldn't play. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and without thinking, she pressed one softly. The note was low and warm, echoing gently across the empty room. Her chest tightened. The sound brought back everything: the excitement of her first recital, the long hours of practice, and the last performance before everything fell apart. A tear slipped down her cheek before she even realized it. She quickly wiped it away, stood up, and moved to finish cleaning. The promise she had made to herself years ago repeated in her mind. Never again. But deep inside, she knew that the music still lived within her, waiting for the right moment to return. The next morning, the manager greeted her with his usual half-smile. He didn't mention what had happened the night before. Maybe he hadn't noticed, or maybe he had heard that single note and decided to pretend he hadn't. Either way, the unspoken tension between her and that piano grew stronger with each passing day. As the week went on, the restaurant prepared for a big event, a private dinner for an important guest. The manager wanted everything perfect: the lighting, the food, the service, even the background music. But the pianist was still unavailable. Everyone could see the worry on his face, though he tried to hide it behind fake confidence. When the big night arrived, the tables were set beautifully. Candles flickered, glasses sparkled, and soft chatter filled the air. But there was still no music. The silence began to feel awkward. A few guests whispered, wondering why the piano was quiet. The young woman stood near the back, carrying trays and trying to focus on her work. But the silence felt heavy to her too. She looked at the piano again, her heart racing. She wanted to help. She wanted to fill the room with something more than just noise. She wanted to bring it to life again. But she remembered the manager's words clearly. "If you touch that piano, I'll quit myself." So she stayed still. After the dinner ended, the guests began to leave. The manager looked exhausted, rubbing his temples. The night hadn't gone badly, but it hadn't been special either. The missing music had left an emptiness in the air. When the last guest stepped out, the young woman found herself standing by the piano once more. The restaurant lights were dim, the floor shining from fresh mopping. She placed a hand on the piano gently, as if greeting an old friend. Her reflection looked back at her from its polished surface, tired eyes, but still carrying a spark. She whispered softly to herself, "Maybe one day." Then she turned off the lights, leaving the piano behind in the quiet room, waiting for the moment when she would finally play again. The days at the restaurant passed one after another, and she slowly began to settle into her new routine. Every morning she arrived early, tied her apron neatly, and greeted everyone with a polite smile. She didn't speak much, but people had started to notice her calmness. Whenever there was tension or rush, she moved quietly but quickly, helping others without being asked. Yet, no matter how busy things got, her eyes always found their way back to that piano in the corner. It stood there, untouched, like a secret she wasn't allowed to share. Sometimes the sunlight from the windows would fall on its keys, making them gleam, and she would pause for just a second, lost in thought. She often told herself it didn't matter anymore, that music was part of her past. But every time she tried to convince herself, her heart disagreed. One afternoon, as the lunch crowd cleared out, she stayed behind to refill glasses and wipe tables. The manager stood by the counter, talking loudly on the phone. His tone was sharp, filled with frustration. "You can't cancel at the last minute," he said into the phone. "This is our busiest weekend. We need you." There was a pause, then he sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Fine, do what you have to. I'll figure something out." He hung up and muttered under his breath. The young woman didn't say anything, but she had a feeling she knew what it was about. Sure enough, when he turned, he said, "The pianist just called off again. Can you believe it? 2 weeks in a row. People come here for the food and the atmosphere, and without music, it feels like a diner, not a fine restaurant. She wanted to say something, but stopped herself. He would only laugh again, just like last time. Instead, she just gave a small nod. "I'm sure you'll find someone, sir." "Yeah, well, it's not that easy," he grumbled. "Good pianists don't grow on trees." He walked away, still muttering, while she quietly finished cleaning. That night, as she walked home, she thought about his words. Good pianists don't grow on trees. A soft smile touched her lips. He didn't know how close one stood right in front of him every day. But even if he did, would it matter? She had promised herself never to return to that world again. The next few days were stressful at the restaurant. The lack of music made the evenings feel dull. The guests noticed. They still came for the food. But something was missing. That gentle background sound that made people linger over dessert or stay for one more drink. The manager tried playing soft tunes from a speaker, but it wasn't the same. Live music had soul. It made people feel connected. One evening, an older couple came in. They were regulars, known for sitting by the same table near the window. They always asked the pianist to play their favorite song, a soft, slow tune they called their song. But that night, when they realized the piano was silent, the woman looked disappointed. "Where's the music tonight?" she asked softly as the young woman poured their water. "Our pianist couldn't make it," she explained politely, "but I hope you still enjoy your evening." The older woman smiled kindly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Oh, that's a shame. We've been coming here for years. My husband and I met to that very song." Her husband chuckled softly. "She's right. Without it, the night feels incomplete." The young woman smiled and nodded, then walked away to hide the heaviness she felt. Their disappointment lingered in her mind long after she left their table. She could have played that song. She knew every note, every pause, every emotion behind it. But she had promised herself not to play again. Still, something inside her began to stir. A quiet voice that whispered, maybe it was time to let the music return. As the evening went on, the restaurant grew quieter. The couple finished their meal and stayed for dessert. The young woman noticed they still glanced toward the piano now and then, as if hoping someone would surprise them with a song. She couldn't bear it anymore. When the last guests were finishing their coffee and the staff had begun clearing tables, she looked at the piano one last time. Her hands shook slightly. She didn't plan it. She just walked over, drawn by something stronger than fear. She sat down on the stool, her heart pounding. The room fell still. Even the soft clinking of dishes from the kitchen stopped for a second. At first she didn't move. Then she placed her hands on the keys and pressed one gently. The note was soft, familiar, and warm. It was like meeting an old friend after years apart. Without thinking, she began to play. The sound filled the restaurant. It started slow and gentle like a whisper, then grew deeper, richer. Every note carried emotion, not practiced skill, but pure feeling. Her fingers moved with ease, remembering everything they once knew. Time seemed to stop. The older couple looked up in surprise. The woman covered her mouth, tears forming in her eyes. The man reached across the table and held her hand. The music wrapped around them like a warm memory. The manager, who had been checking receipts behind the counter, turned slowly, confusion on his face. His eyes widened as he realized who was playing. The staff gathered near the kitchen door, listening quietly. Some smiled, others just stared in disbelief. No one had ever seen her like this, so alive, so at peace. Her whole body seemed to move with the melody. For those few minutes, the restaurant didn't feel like a workplace, it felt like a dream. When she finished the song, the last note lingered in the air. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that comes after something beautiful. Then softly, applause filled the room. The guests clapped, the staff joined in, and even the manager stood frozen, unable to find words. The older woman approached her with tears still in her eyes. "That was the song," she said softly. "You played it just like we remember. Thank you, dear." The young woman smiled shyly, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm glad you liked it. The manager finally spoke. "I thought I said—" He stopped mid-sentence. His tone wasn't angry now. It was uncertain, almost gentle. "Where did you learn to play like that?" She stood, feeling nervous under everyone's gaze. "It's just something I used to do," she said quietly. "A long time ago." He didn't reply right away. He looked at the piano, then back at her. "Well, maybe I was wrong to make that joke." His voice softened. "That was something special." She smiled politely, unsure what else to say, and excused herself to the back. But as she walked away, she felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time since she started working there, she didn't feel like a stranger in her own skin. Later that night, when everyone had left and the lights were dimmed, she returned to the piano. She didn't play this time, just sat there, her fingers resting on her lap. The air still seemed to hold the echo of her song. She thought about the faces she saw while playing, the smiles, the tears, the surprise. For so long she believed her music belonged to the past, to a version of herself she had lost. But tonight had shown her something else. Maybe it never truly left her. Maybe it had just been waiting. When the manager came out of his office, he found her still sitting there. For once, his voice wasn't sharp. "You should go home," he said gently. "It's been a long night." She nodded and stood up. "I'm sorry if I caused trouble." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't cause trouble," he said. "You reminded this place what it's supposed to feel like." She looked at him, surprised by his tone. He smiled faintly. "Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." On her way home, she walked slower than usual. The streets were quiet and the air felt cool against her face. She didn't rush. Her heart was still full from the music she had released. For years she had hidden that part of herself, afraid it would bring pain. But tonight it brought something else. Peace. She stopped at a small park nearby and sat on a bench. The city lights glowed softly in the distance. She closed her eyes and imagined the sound of the piano again, echoing softly in her mind. Maybe tomorrow things would be different. Maybe the music had found its way back to her for a reason. And for the first time in years, she didn't try to stop it. She simply let it be. The next morning, she arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. The streets were still quiet, and a thin layer of mist hung in the air. She walked slowly, thinking about what had happened the night before. It felt almost unreal. The applause, the smiles, the music flowing through her fingers again after all these years. She had only wanted to bring a moment of happiness to that couple, but something inside her had awakened. When she entered the restaurant, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The lights were still dim, and only 2 other workers were there, setting up for the day. They greeted her with warm smiles, something different in their eyes this time. It wasn't just politeness, it was respect. One of them, a kind older woman who worked as a hostess, approached her quietly. "You played beautifully last night," she said softly. "We were all moved. You brought life back into this place." She blushed slightly, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't plan to. It just happened." The woman nodded with understanding. "Sometimes the things we try to hide find their own way back. Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Before she could reply, the manager walked in. His usual firm expression had softened. He looked at her briefly before speaking to the staff. "Morning, everyone. Let's make sure we're ready for the lunch crowd." Then as he passed by her, he paused and said quietly, "I need to talk to you later." Her heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if he was angry or impressed. Either way, she couldn't stop thinking about it all morning. When the lunch rush ended, he called her into his office. She stepped inside carefully, unsure of what to expect. He was sitting behind his desk, looking at a pile of papers, but his eyes lifted as soon as she entered. "Close the door," he said, his tone calm. She obeyed quietly. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "I have to admit," he said finally, "I didn't see that coming." You play like someone who's been doing it their whole life." She hesitated. "I used to, before I started working here." He raised an eyebrow. "Used to? You mean professionally?" She nodded. "Yes, I played since I was a child. I studied at an academy, but I stopped a few years ago." He leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing his usual strictness. Why would someone with that kind of talent stop? Her hands fidgeted in front of her. She looked down. Sometimes life gives you reasons you can't ignore. He didn't push her for details. Instead, he nodded slowly, understanding that some stories didn't need to be told. After a moment, he said, "The guests loved your playing last night. Even the couple who celebrated their anniversary left a big tip and a note saying they'd never forget that evening." She smiled faintly. "I'm happy they liked it." He glanced toward the dining room through the glass wall of his office. "Look, I know what I said about the piano when you started. That was, well, it was supposed to be a joke. Maybe not a very good one. But if you ever feel like playing again, during the quiet hours or even when we have guests, I won't stop you." She looked up, surprised. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely," he said. "That performance brought something into this place we didn't even know we were missing." She thanked him softly and left the office, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. She hadn't expected that kind of reaction. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about his words. If you ever feel like playing again. The idea scared her and comforted her at the same time. That evening, after the restaurant closed, she sat at the piano again. No one else was there. She let her fingers rest on the keys, but she didn't play. She just sat there, letting the memories return. Her childhood recitals, the hours of practice, her teacher's voice guiding her through difficult pieces. And then the memory that always hurt the most. Her last performance before she stopped playing altogether. It had been in a large concert hall filled with hundreds of people. She remembered the pressure, the bright lights, and the way her hands shook just before she started. Her father had been in the audience that night, smiling proudly. It was supposed to be her biggest performance, the one that would open doors for her career. But halfway through, she froze. The notes she had practiced for months vanished from her mind. She sat there in silence, unable to move until the applause turned to whispers. That night, everything she believed about herself crumbled. Soon after, her father fell ill and she quit music completely. The memory still hurt, but now, sitting alone in the quiet restaurant, she realized something had changed. The thought of playing no longer filled her with fear. It filled her with peace. The next day, the restaurant was busier than usual. Word had spread about the mysterious waitress who played the piano like a professional. Some guests came just to see if the rumors were true. The manager hadn't planned to advertise it, but people talked. A few even asked her directly if she would play that night. She didn't know what to say, but the gentle encouragement from her coworkers gave her courage. That evening, when the crowd had settled and the lights dimmed, she sat down at the piano again. This time she wasn't nervous. She began to play a simple melody, soft, emotional, and warm. Conversations quieted. People turned their heads. Her music wrapped around the room like a gentle breeze. Every note carried emotion, not from perfection, but from honesty. As she played, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. The manager standing near the bar, watching quietly with a faint smile. For the first time since she met him, his eyes didn't look strict or cold. They looked proud. The song ended and the room erupted into applause again. Some people even stood. She smiled shyly and nodded before returning to her duties. But that night everything changed. People left bigger tips. They asked about her, wanted to know her story, wanted to hear her again. The restaurant, once just another place to eat, had turned into something special. A place with heart. After closing, the manager approached her as she wiped down the counter. "You know, you might have started something we can't stop," he said lightly. She laughed softly. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted to help." "Sometimes the best things happen by accident," he replied. Then, after a pause, he added, "You brought warmth to this place. I think we all needed that." His words stayed with her long after he left. She realized that music didn't have to belong to concert halls or grand audiences. It could live here, in simple moments, bringing light to everyday life. Over the next few weeks, she began playing regularly. Sometimes only one song a night, sometimes more if guests requested it. People started calling her the soul of the restaurant. Some filmed her performances and posted them online. She didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just for fun. But one day, something unexpected happened. A young man walked in carrying a small camera. He introduced himself politely and said he worked for a local news channel. "We saw a video of you playing here," he said. "It's been getting a lot of attention. We'd love to feature you in a small story about hidden talents in our community." She was stunned. "Oh, I don't know about that," she said nervously. "I'm just a waitress." The manager, standing nearby, smiled. "You're not just a waitress anymore. You're part of what makes this place special." After some hesitation, she agreed. The reporter filmed a short interview, asking about her journey. She spoke simply, without drama, about her love for music, about losing it and finding it again in the most unexpected place. The story aired a few days later. People began visiting the restaurant from other towns, curious to see the woman who had rediscovered her gift. Every night she played, the room filled with quiet wonder. She still worked hard, serving tables, greeting guests, helping the staff. But now her evenings ended with music that touched hearts. She realized she didn't need a stage or fame. She just needed to play, for herself, for others, for peace. One night, as the last song faded and the applause died down, she looked up and saw the manager watching again, his arms crossed but a small proud smile on his face. Their eyes met briefly, and in that simple moment no words were needed. Both knew something had changed forever. The piano that once sat silent had found its voice again, and so had she. The sound of the piano faded slowly, like the last whisper of a long-forgotten dream. The young woman sat still for a moment, her hands trembling slightly above the keys. For a few seconds, the restaurant remained frozen in silence. No one moved, no dishes clinked, no soft chatter filled the air. Every eye in the room was on her. Then, as if the world took a deep breath, a wave of applause broke out. People clapped, some even stood up. A few guests had tears in their eyes. The quiet girl who was once invisible had just brought the entire restaurant to its feet. The manager, who had been standing by the counter with his arms crossed, was completely speechless. His face softened, his eyes wide in disbelief. He had joked once that if she ever touched the piano, he would quit. Now he didn't know what to say. The power in her playing had reached everyone, including him. She didn't look at anyone, didn't even smile. She just bowed her head slightly and got up, walking quietly toward the kitchen, her face calm but her heart racing. As she disappeared behind the door, the applause slowly faded. The elderly couple who had asked for the song were still holding hands, smiling warmly. The man who had requested the tune asked the manager, "Who is she?" That was extraordinary. The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. He didn't know anything about her past. He only knew she had joined a few weeks ago, quiet and polite, never asking for attention. He just shook his head and said softly, "I don't know, but I think we all just witnessed something special." In the kitchen, she leaned against the counter, breathing deeply. Her coworkers came rushing in, excited and shocked. They couldn't stop talking about what they had just seen. One of them said, "Why didn't you tell us you could play like that?" She just smiled faintly, brushing it off, saying, "It's been a long time." They could tell there was more behind those words, something she didn't want to talk about yet. Later that night, when the restaurant closed, she stayed back to clean up. The manager came over, still looking dazed. "You didn't tell me you could play like that," he said quietly. She gave a small shrug. "It wasn't important," she replied. He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "It is now." Then he smiled awkwardly, the kind of smile that admitted he had misjudged her. "You really surprised me tonight," he said, his tone softer than usual. "I guess I should thank you. You saved the evening." She nodded, saying nothing more. As the manager walked away, she turned back to the piano. The lid was still open, the keys catching a faint reflection from the dim lights. For the first time in years, she felt something stirring inside, something she thought was gone forever. Music had always been her way of speaking when words failed her. It had been her comfort, her joy, and also her pain. But that night, it felt different. It didn't hurt anymore. It felt like healing. The next morning, everyone was still talking about what had happened. The video someone had recorded on their phone had already begun spreading on social media. Guests were sharing it, tagging the restaurant, calling her the mystery pianist. People were amazed that such talent had been hidden behind an apron and a serving tray. The staff teased her gently about becoming famous, but she just laughed it off, insisting it was nothing. However, not everyone could forget what they had seen. Among the customers that night had been a local musician who performed in small concerts and taught piano in the city. He recognized something in her playing, something rare. He reached out to the restaurant the next day asking for her contact. The manager hesitated at first, but when he saw how sincere the man was, he passed along a message. When she came in for her shift that evening, the manager told her about the call. "A man named Lewis, he says he's a pianist. He wants to talk to you," he said, handing her a note. She frowned slightly, unsure if she wanted to reopen that part of her life. "I don't know if I should," she said quietly. "Maybe it's better if I stay here." The manager shook his head. "You should at least hear what he has to say. You can't hide from something like this forever." His tone wasn't harsh this time. It was kind, almost fatherly. She looked down at the note for a long moment before folding it and putting it in her pocket. The rest of the evening passed quickly, but her thoughts kept drifting back to that phone call. By the time her shift ended, she decided to call. The man on the other end sounded warm and encouraging. "I saw you play," he said. "You have something special. You shouldn't let it go to waste." She didn't know how to respond. He continued, "I've seen many performers, but there's something in your music. It's real. I'd like to help you get back to it if you'll let me." She hesitated. "It's been years," she whispered. "I'm not who I used to be." He replied gently, "That's exactly why your music matters now. It's full of life." That night she sat by her window staring at the stars. She thought about the past, the competitions, the long hours of practice, the stage lights, the applause. And then she thought about the silence that came after she lost everything that once inspired her to play. Maybe it was time to stop running from it. Maybe it was time to start again, not for fame or recognition, but for herself. The next few days, more people began coming to the restaurant, hoping to see her perform again. The manager, still a little proud but now more understanding, asked her one evening, "Would you like to play again this weekend? People keep asking about you." She looked at him with uncertainty. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I thought you said you'd quit if I touched the piano again." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I take that back. I think we need you more than you need us." His honesty made her smile for the first time since she'd joined. That weekend, the restaurant was packed. Every seat was taken, and the soft buzz of conversation filled the air. When she sat at the piano again, the room fell silent instantly. She took a deep breath, her fingers hovering above the keys. This time there was no hesitation, no fear. She began to play, a different song, lighter, filled with warmth and hope. It wasn't a sad memory anymore. It was a promise of new beginnings. The crowd was once again mesmerized. The music floated gently through the air, wrapping everyone in its softness. Even the staff stopped to listen, leaning against walls and counters, smiling quietly. The manager watched from the side, his expression full of pride. He knew now that she was more than an employee. She was the soul of the place. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. People called out asking for one more song. She laughed softly and played one last melody, a cheerful tune that made everyone's hearts feel lighter. Afterward, as the guests left, several came up to thank her. Some said her music reminded them of home. Others said it made them cry in a good way. She listened, humbled and grateful. Later that night, when the lights dimmed and the restaurant emptied, she stayed behind again, cleaning the tables. The manager came over, leaning against the counter. "You've changed this place," he said with a smile. "You've changed me too." She looked at him, surprised. "How so?" He shrugged. "I used to think people were only what they showed on the surface. You proved me wrong." She didn't know what to say. For the first time, she felt truly seen. Not as a waitress, not as a performer, but as a person who had found her way back to herself. As she closed the piano lid for the night, she whispered a quiet thank you. To the music, to the people who listened, and to herself for finally letting go of fear. Outside, the night was calm. The air smelled of rain, and somewhere in the distance a car horn echoed softly. She stepped out, looking up at the sky. It wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something new, something she never expected to find again. Peace. A few days after that second performance, the restaurant was buzzing with excitement. People kept coming in asking if the girl at the piano would play again. Some came from far away, saying they had seen her video online. The clip of her first performance had gone viral, spreading faster than anyone expected. News pages shared it with titles like, "Waitress leaves everyone speechless with her piano performance." But she didn't even know how big it had become until the manager showed her. He came to her one afternoon, holding his phone and grinning. "You need to see this," he said, showing her the video. Her eyes widened as she watched herself on screen, sitting at the piano playing with all her heart. The comments were full of praise. People were saying her music brought them to tears, that her story inspired them to chase their dreams again. She didn't know how to react. It was strange seeing herself like that after years of hiding away from the spotlight. "I didn't expect this," she whispered. The manager laughed softly. "Well, the world did. Looks like you've got fans now." She didn't care much about being famous. What mattered to her was the feeling she had when she played. But this time something was different. She realized her music had reached people she had never met. It made them feel something deep, something real. That meant more to her than applause or attention. She wanted to keep that alive. Within days, reporters started showing up. The restaurant got calls from newspapers and local TV stations asking about the mysterious pianist. The manager tried to protect her at first, not wanting to overwhelm her. "She's just one of us," he said proudly. "But she's also something special." When he told her about the interview, she hesitated. "I'm not ready for that," she said quietly. "I just want to keep things simple." He nodded understandingly. "Then we'll keep it simple. But don't hide from who you are anymore." That night she played again. Not for the crowd, not for the camera, but because she wanted to. The restaurant was full, yet she closed her eyes and imagined it was just her and the music. Her fingers glided across the keys with ease, every note carrying warmth. It wasn't about perfection anymore. It was about truth. The sound filled the air like a soft memory, and everyone who listened felt connected, as if they were part of something bigger. When she finished, people didn't just clap, they stood up. The applause was filled with gratitude, not just admiration. After that, she began playing more often. The restaurant became known not just for its food, but for its music. People booked tables weeks in advance, hoping to catch her at the piano. The manager made sure she never felt pressured. "Play when you feel like it," he told her. "That's when it's real." And so she did. Sometimes she played in the middle of the day, other times late at night when only a few customers remained. Each performance felt alive in its own way. One evening, the same man who had called her before, the music teacher, came to visit again. He waited until the restaurant was quiet, then approached her as she was wiping the piano keys. "I knew it," he said with a kind smile. "You belong here. Not behind a tray, but behind these keys." She smiled softly, her eyes calm. "Maybe you're right," she said. He sat down beside her, watching the way she touched the piano with care. "Do you ever think about playing on stage again?" he asked gently. She thought for a moment. "I used to dream of it," she said. "Then I stopped dreaming for a while. But now maybe I could," he nodded. "If you do, don't do it for the stage. Do it for the sound, for the people who need to hear it." His words stayed with her long after he left. Weeks passed, and her story kept spreading. One evening, a music academy invited her to perform at a charity concert. She was nervous at first, unsure if she was ready to return to that world. The manager encouraged her, saying, "You've already touched more hearts here than most people do in a lifetime. Don't be afraid to share that again." His faith in her gave her courage. She agreed to perform. When the night of the concert arrived, she stood backstage, her heart racing. It had been years since she had played for a real audience outside the restaurant. The lights, the crowd, the quiet hum of anticipation, it all came flooding back. But this time she wasn't the same person. She wasn't chasing perfection or approval. She was just sharing a piece of herself. As she stepped onto the stage, the audience went silent. She took a deep breath and sat at the piano. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to play. The melody was gentle, full of emotion. Each note carried her journey, her loss, her fear, her rediscovery. People listened, holding their breath. Some closed their eyes, letting the music speak for them. By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The applause was thunderous, but what she felt inside was peace. She smiled through tears, bowing humbly. After the concert, people came to her, thanking her for reminding them that it's never too late to return to what you love. She didn't see herself as a legend or a star. She was just someone who found her way back to music. Back at the restaurant, things remained warm and simple. The manager was proud. The staff treated her like family, and the customers continued to listen with quiet admiration. She became a symbol of hope for many, proof that talent never truly fades and that even after life breaks you, it's possible to start again. Sometimes she still worked as a server, chatting and laughing with regulars, but everyone knew she wasn't just part of the staff anymore. She was the heart of the place. One evening, after closing, she sat alone at the piano again. The restaurant was dark except for the soft glow from a single lamp. She played quietly, just for herself. The notes echoed softly in the empty room. The manager walked out from the kitchen, listening quietly without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You know, I used to think that piano was just decoration. Now I realize it was waiting for you." She looked up and smiled, saying, "Maybe it was waiting for me to stop being afraid." They shared a laugh, a quiet, comfortable one that spoke of respect and friendship. Before leaving, she ran her hand across the smooth wood of the piano, whispering thank you, not just to the instrument, but to life itself, for giving her another chance. Over the months, more invitations came, but she stayed grounded. Sometimes she performed at small events, sometimes she played at the restaurant, and sometimes she just played at home. Her music became a source of comfort for people around her and for herself. She no longer played to impress. She played to connect. The manager often joked with new staff, "You see that piano? Don't touch it unless you plan to change your life." Everyone would laugh, but there was truth behind his words. That piano had changed everything, for her, for him, for everyone who heard her play. Years later, people still talked about the night the waitress touched the piano and changed everything. Her performances were remembered not for technical skill alone, but for the emotion behind them. She had reminded people that true talent isn't loud or showy, it's honest. And honesty in music, like in life, never fades. And so she continued to play. Some nights her music was joyful, other nights it carried quiet sorrow, but every note she played came from her heart. The world might have called her a legend, but to her she was simply someone who had found her way back home, back to the sound that had always been waiting for her.